How does that sound?
Perfect. I can hear you loud and clear now.
Great. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you. I'm excited for this conversation. I did a little bit of an intro of who you are and how I got a opportunity to talk with you. Mahler X is a mutual friend of ours, and after the conversation that I had with Tom, who is ex-Mormon, I wanted to get another perspective of someone who is actively practicing and Christian, and you've also been through seminary, so you've done a lot of study on theology, Christianity, and the history of the world at the time of Christ, which is awesome. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, you bet. I appreciate the invitation.
So I wanted to start by asking you some about your denomination, because Christianity is pretty broad. There are a lot of different interpretations of the Bible and how to break down different passages and what they mean. And then even within Protestantism, that's pretty broad. So could you describe that for us? What kind of Christian are you, basically?
Yeah, so I belong to the United Methodist denomination, which interestingly at this season is in turmoil. The United Methodist Church is about to split in all likelihood into at least two, if not more, denominations. So that's kind of sort of been the ebb and flow of denominations, at least within Protestantism. Sometimes you'll see denominations merge. In the 60s, the Evangelical United Brethren Church or denomination merged with what was then called the Methodist Church
Mm-hmm.
to become the United Methodist Church, and so that was a merger. Now we're looking at a split. So um, there are a number of denominations that are closely related to one another because they share a common heritage to the work of John Wesley, first in England and then through representatives here in the States back in the 1700s. So, broadly speaking, Methodism is part of a family of denominations that have ties to John Wesley, or what we would call Wesleyan roots. So the
Mm.
Church of the Nazarene, the Wesleyan Church, the Free Methodist Church, and others.
What would you say are some of the most important ideals or concepts that Wesley brought to Christianity and to the faith?
Yeah, great question. Well, first and foremost, he was a scholar. He was a professor at Oxford University, so he was very well versed and well studied. So he championed the life of the mind, but he also had just a real knack of bringing knowledge and learning, understanding to lay people, to common people, people in the streets. He got in trouble with the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England at that point, out of which Methodism came, because he would preach outside of his church building, what they called it the parish. He would preach outside of his jurisdiction, practicing open air preaching to reach people who needed to hear the message. And that caught him a lot of flack because they weren't supposed to do that at that point.
That sounds wild to me. That's
So
like gang behavior. This is our turf. You can't preach the word on our turf.
yeah, yeah. So there's a story that goes that his bishop or whoever was above him said to him, Mr. Wesley, you will confine your preaching to your parish. And Wesley was a little short guy, just over 5 foot tall, and up on his toes, you can just see him saying, with all due respect, sir, the world is my parish. And so his commitment was to bring the message of Christ to the world. He was just first and foremost a student of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he believed that this world matters, which is funny to say because there are certain Christian denominations that sort of write off this world, like what happens in this world doesn't matter because it's doomed, it's going to burn someday. What we're interested in is the life to come, the eternity. So you'll hear people say, I've got my eyes to the skies. So they're looking really toward life on the other side. But for Wesley, he said this life matters. God created the world and all that was in it, and Jesus came into this world, and Jesus came to care for people, to heal, to restore relationships. So one of Wesley's distinctives was that he actually put together a little publication that was his most widely distributed work ever. And it was just a list of natural remedies that people out in the out in the outlying areas of England could resource. They couldn't get to drugstores if they were sick, so these were things that they could get, out in the field or out in the woods to help their bodies heal, because he knew that the body mattered. And for Wesley, salvation, or the idea of being saved, is not just something that you wait for in the future life, but that actually begins today when you start living what Jesus would call life in abundance, a much fuller, richer life. So those are some of the distinctives. It was interesting because at the time Wesley started his work and his ministry, there was kind of this big conflict between, and this may not make sense to everybody, but there was a big conflict in continental Europe between the Roman Catholic Church based out of Rome and the Protestant movement, which 100 or 200 years earlier was a response to some abuses by the Roman Catholic Church. So you've got Protestants and you've got Catholics really at odds with one another. And one of John Wesley's distinctives was to say, hey, can we not just find the best of both worlds and bring these together in what he would call sort of a middle way? And that really represents where Methodism traditionally stands. I don't know how helpful that is or not.
It is. It sounds like it's the main concept is the freedom to practice and the freedom to preach the word, and that anyone should be able to do that. One thing that was a very historical aspect of the church in Europe was only certain people could preach the word of God, and only certain people could basically pass along your confessions or your prayers to God. And from my perspective, I was raised Protestant, Baptist, and Bible Christian mainly. But the most important concept was that your relationship was not between you, a priest, and God. It was between you and God directly. So it kind of cut out that middle path. There was also a lot of power of the church in Europe in that period. And everyone's heard the phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. And right. The church at certain points was more powerful than a lot of governments were. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the message of Christ's life and stuff can be almost completely lost when you have people who are rising through the ranks in the church, and that gives them a lot more power, and it's rewarding a power-seeking behavior instead of who is the most Christ-like person. They should be higher ranking. It's whoever is the person who's like most aggressively pursuing that path. So I think I have a better idea of Methodism now. I had a friend a couple streets down, I think in elementary school, who is Methodist, and I went to church with him once or twice. The only difference between his church, Methodist church, and my church, Baptist church, was their pastor wore a different outfit. But aside from that, mm-hmm. I couldn't really tell too much of a difference in the message.
Yeah. Well, organizationally, one thing that's different between a Methodist and a Baptist church is that, Methodism is organized around what's called an episcopacy, which is to say a bishop. So here in the U.S., there typically, on average, there's about one bishop over an area about the size of a state. More densely populated states will have more bishops. Sometimes there's a bishop over multiple state areas, but the bishop assigns pastors to their churches. In a Baptist church, that's what we would call a called system, where a church can actually just hire a pastor. They send out job postings and take applications, and then they decide at the local level who their pastor will be. So in terms of organization, that's a difference. But I think you're right, Neuro. I think that power can absolutely corrupt. I started off, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's making me think of, this is more of a newer wave, but you've got a lot of prosperity gospel Christianity that's been gaining a lot of momentum in the United States, which is, you've got pastors who are super, super rich. They've got helicopters and all these like very fantastical things. And one of the concepts they preach is that if you give wealth to me, then you will receive wealth from God, kind of a thing, which is
Right.
it's very lucrative for them, but it doesn't really seem like what Christ was doing in the Bible, if memory serves.
Yeah, yeah. So that really, and that just ties back to the whole issue between, Catholics and Protestants, because Martin Luther, as a Catholic priest, observed that the Catholic Church really wasn't living into biblical holiness. Because at that time there were abuses in the church, and let me just say there are lots of things about Roman Catholicism that I greatly value and think that we need to hear from. But at that time, the Pope was trying to raise money to build what is now St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and to raise money, they decided that they would sell what are called indulgences. So an indulgence is basically a little certificate that an average ordinary person can buy to have basically a Catholic priest pray for their deceased relatives and to pray them out of purgatory into heaven. Now, I'm not a Catholic and I don't know Catholic doctrine super well, and I'm not a church historian to get all the details, but in broad strokes, this is what was happening. So they're raising money by selling these indulgences. Well, Luther saw right through that, and he protested it, and eventually just he left the church. And there were other parts of Europe that were protesting other kinds of things, but a lot of these were this what we see even today in this prosperity theology, which in effect says, God wants to bless you, and of course God wants to bless us, but I'm not sure that money is necessarily such a blessing. I mean, if you're starving to death and money can buy you food, that's a huge blessing. But if
Hmm.
you've got so much money that's all you think about or worry about, or it occupies your time, or it makes you a different person, that's a problem.
Well, one of the biggest things that I think made a lasting impression on me from growing up Christian was the concept of servant leadership. And that's a thing that Christ was really different from a lot of other leaders in his stance and his interaction with other people. He didn't come to the world to be served and to be elevated and put onto a huge throne with all these gems and jewels and armies and that kind of thing. He was washing people's feet and kneeling down and talking to kids and just talking to people out in the open about what he believed and that kind of thing. So it was a much more humble approach to stuff. So I would have basically an eyebrow raise anytime I see someone who's really flashing how successful they are while also talking about their spirituality at the same time. It seems
Yeah.
pretty dishonest, and it seems like the congregation is there to serve that person because they're giving them basically an awesome job that pays super well. But are they actually connecting with the individuals who are showing up and helping them to grow spiritually?
Yeah. Yeah. So you may remember the scene from the third Indiana Jones movie. I think it's the Last Crusade, where they're after the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus drank from
Hmm.
the night of his last meal, which interestingly, historically, would be this week. This is Wednesday afternoon. It would be tomorrow night, which is when we celebrate that as a church. So Indiana Jones chooses wisely because he picks the cup of all those chalices and all their ornamentation and their beauty and their precious metals, of all those cups that he could choose from. He knew that the cup that Jesus drank from was the basic little wooden one, right? He says
Yeah.
that's the cup of a carpenter.
Hmm.
Uh, and Jesus said just straight up, he said, I came not to be served, but to serve. And then he taught his disciples to do likewise. And he
Hmm.
said that stooping at their feet, washing their feet.
Hmm.
Yeah.
One of the kind of broader concepts I wanted to get at with you is your personal spiritual journey. So, getting saved, getting baptized, and then going through seminary. I know it's been your life's journey, but kind of in a shorter form, what was that process like for you? I guess I could just share mine first. I was about 4 years old, I think, when I was going to Sunday school and that kind of thing, and I could see that your spirituality, your like sense of where your heart is was the most important thing, like more important than your grades and all this other stuff.
Mhm.
So I would say I was saved when I was 4, and then being baptized was more of a public profession of your faith, where you would generally be saved before then, and you had to, at my church, you had to have a meeting with the pastor and explain to them clearly why you thought that you were ready to be baptized. So it wasn't
Right.
just you're trying to do it to score some points with your friends. You had to actually have some good reasons for why that was a meaningful step for you. I know a lot of different churches have different requirements. Catholic churches have confirmation before then, they have to take classes and that kind of thing.
Right.
So, what
Mhm.
was your spiritual growth arc like from saved to baptized to seminary?
Yeah. So my family, when I was a kid, attended a Methodist church. We didn't attend every Sunday, but I mean that was our church. So in the Methodist tradition, infants are baptized. So I was baptized by my mom and dad, and of course that I wasn't aware of that because I was just a baby. Uh, But then, probably in seventh or eighth grade, I got involved in an independent Christian church out in the country. I grew up in the Midwest and just literally in the middle of nowhere. So, like you described, I rode my bike a mile to the church and met with the pastor, and he explained to me salvation and what was involved in that. And so I felt like, I got two choices. I can accept Jesus and go to heaven, or I can not, and the consequences will be hell. And so I said, well, I'd be an idiot, not to accept Jesus. So I did, and I was actually baptized by immersion, which means dunked in, it looked like something about the size of a hot tub, right? In the church, was immersed in the water, and knew at that moment that I was committing to a life for Jesus, right?
Hmm.
Well, it was just a few years after that in high school that I had what you might call a crisis of faith. I wasn't sure about my salvation. I wasn't sure that if I died that I would go to heaven, and I was very concerned about some of my behaviors, my actions, things that honestly, my buddies and I were getting involved in, and our girlfriends and us were getting, what I mean.
Yep.
And I really, what I thought, I don't know. So I expressed my concern to somebody, an adult who kind of knew the score. And I remember that person saying, Brad, if you're fearful for your salvation, you should read the book of Revelation because it'll scare the hell out of you. And I thought, if there's any hell in me, I want it scared out. So I went into our bathroom in our house and I locked the door and I picked up a little paperback copy of the Good News Bible, and I read the book of Revelation. And I was fascinated by it, but I had no idea what I had read. That made no sense to me at all. So I thought maybe I just need to read what comes right before that to make sense out of Revelation. Well, what comes before it is this little tiny letter by a guy named Jude. No bearing on Revelation at all. So I started methodically just moving my way through the New Testament that summer in the bathroom, reading the New Testament in reverse order.
Hmm.
Um, and I'll tell you honestly, it was really hard for me reading through the letters of Paul, which are kind of in the middle of the New Testament, because I didn't know who he was, didn't know what he was talking about, didn't understand the issues. But I'll tell you, when I got to the Gospels, and there are four of those, four gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, each from a different perspective.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
There you go. Stick with those. You can't go wrong. Yep, that's it. Um, so when I encountered those and I met Jesus for the first time in Scripture, my life changed forever. I fell in love with his mission, his person, his vision for life, and really loved the way that his disciples responded to his call so radically. So that's when really the hook set. Um, Later in life, there were other points that really sort of secured that for me, that commitment. And it was really in seminary and then into my doctoral work when I began looking at historical evidence, looking at the Bible as a literary work, asking questions, philosophy, and sociology, even anthropology, just bringing together lots of disciplines, and largely approaching faith what I would call inductively. And what that means is sort of like Sherlock Holmes would walk into a crime scene and he would just start looking around. He said, "What's the evidence? What's the evidence? What's the most likely explanation of the evidence?" So I don't know if you're familiar with the new BBC version of the modern day Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch and
Mm-hmm.
um, who plays Watson, Martin Freeman. But there's this little scene where they walk into a crime scene where it seems pretty apparent that there's a suicide, and the detective and Watson say, "Yep, yep, looks like a suicide. Looks pretty straightforward." And then Sherlock says this: "You all are so quick to believe what you want to believe, but you don't even look at the evidence." And so, from an inductive perspective, my faith journey has really been about, what makes sense, what has explanatory power.
Mm-hmm.
And a deductive approach would be dogmatic. It would say this is absolutely true. It's beyond dispute. We can't talk about it. We can't ask questions. We can't challenge it. That's a deductive approach. That's not my approach. My approach is inductive. I always learning more, always willing to ask questions, open to new possibilities, you might say.
Yeah, one thing that
So,
frustrated me a lot growing up in the church was how few Christians actually read the Bible. Very
mhm,
few, I would say, at my church had, I guess not few, but a lot of people hadn't even read through it all the way. The Old Testament is pretty
right.
long, but the New Testament, I
Yeah.
think, is a lot more digestible. So, as an actively
Hmm.
practicing Christian, the New Testament is not that long. People watch lots of TV shows and movies. If you're actually practicing this faith, like, come on, people,
Yeah.
read the New Testament.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
my favorite book
Yeah.
was Romans, mainly
Mm,
because it seemed really clear to me. It's a book that's talking about how to live a good life, live following Christ and that kind of thing. There's less metaphor and less stuff that I think could be confused or interpreted in different ways. So to me, it felt like a really good guide for how to live.
yeah. 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 It's been said that Paul's letter to the Romans, and he's writing a letter to the church that was established in Rome in the first century. It's been said that that little letter has been the most commented on written piece in human history. That's how profound it has been in our historical landscape. So yeah, and what troubles me, Neuro, is I got to be careful how I say this because I can't back it up with data, but I suspect that we've got a lot of church leaders across all denominations, um, church leaders who haven't read the entire Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one of my commitments is to read through the whole Bible each year in a year. And we're doing this as a church. We've done it for 2 or 3 years now. So you just read a little bit every day, and at the end of the year, you've read the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you what, it's like, once you've watched a movie and you get to the end and you understand what's actually going on, and you go back and you watch that movie again, you see it differently.
Mm-hmm.
You see that story differently.
My dad does that pretty regularly. I think he's got one of those Bibles that just has it like for each day of the year you read up
Yeah.
to here. And he was
Yeah.
taking a ferry to work because they lived on an island before. So that was a really nice
Mm,
opportunity to just get in the Word a little
yeah.
bit, start the day with a good kind of positive and righteous intention. And I think
Yeah.
righteousness is one of the words that I would really like to see more in the vocabulary of both Christians and secular people in the States. The concept of righteousness is something that I believe every human being should be able to understand. You can debate any given behavior, but overall, striving to do good and to be good to other people is something that's really impactful. And the Bible has a lot of conversation on what is righteousness. So being able
Right.
to just
Yeah.
be in the Word,
Absolutely.
I think it allows you to be regularly contemplating that and thinking about your actions day to day. You were talking about your high school experience and how high school party culture, it doesn't always go in line with righteousness.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's not just even it's not just even, sort of what you do. It's also what you think and how you relate to people and your attitude. I'll tell you, Neuro, when I was a kid, even as a Christian, even after having been dunked, baptized in the water, I was mean. I bullied kids. I made fun of kids mercilessly. And here's an interesting thing, Facebook, for good or for ill, really has power. So a few years ago, a high school um, reached out to a high school friend. Well, I say friend, someone I went to high school with, but I made fun of him and I bullied him. I reached out to him a few years ago through Facebook because I had seen he made a post and I was able to message him and I just said, I am so incredibly sorry. You didn't deserve that. I know now that that's not righteousness. That's the opposite. I am so sorry. And if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'll be so grateful. And he responded, Brad, we were kids. We were just being goofy. Yeah, I'm not holding that against you.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you that freedom, that liberation, that peace that came just through grace. He gave me grace. And so one of the real emphases by Jesus, and this is part of what captured my attention when I first read about Jesus, is in the Gospel of Matthew and in a little 3-chapter stretch that we call the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus goes up onto the mountain and he teaches. It's just nonstop teaching. The whole thing is that he says that righteousness is not like the religious leaders who, he said basically have cups that are clean on the outside but filthy on the inside. And he says, these people are hypocrites. They put on masks and they act one way in public, but in reality they're different. He says that's not righteousness. My followers have to have righteousness that exceeds that. And what he does is he turns to this internal position, this inner spirit of love, what John Wesley called holy love. And this is a classic Wesleyan distinctive that I should have mentioned, is it is very interested in the inner spiritual health of the believer, right? Because the external stuff, our actions, our words, our practices, those flow out of what we think and how we feel about things and our attitudes. So these things should be consistent. We should be, integrated people. What we practice should be what we preach, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the concepts that jumped out at me when you're talking about apologizing to your friend from school was taking responsibility. I've been leading a classic WoW guild over the past year and a half, which is a group of 40 or so people who all need to coordinate together to clear the content and fight the bosses and stuff. And with that many people filtering around, you can't have a perfect operation. There are going to be mistakes, and someone needs to take responsibility for them. And taking responsibility is something in a group setting that I haven't really had to do too much. A lot of my career trajectory has been very much a solo kind of thing where I'm streaming, I'm playing the game, I win or I lose. Maybe I make people laugh, maybe I make a guide, that kind of a thing. And this is a group of people where they all have something at stake, and maybe something happens and a bunch of people get upset. So this something happens, people are upset. Who is going to step in and take responsibility? Because it's not always just one person's fault. Sometimes it's a group mistake, or maybe there are multiple people involved in it. And just being the first to step forward and to give a complete apology and talk about what should have been done instead, and then set an intention for how things should be moving forward. It doesn't feel fun. It feels pretty heavy and gross to have to do that, but it gives a ton of relief to the rest of the group because they feel like they got some closure, they got recognition that this was indeed a mistake. So it basically meant that if they were hurt by it, their feelings mattered and they were acknowledged. But yeah, that's been definitely a building experience for me this past year and a half. And
Yeah.
it sort of reminds me of the concept of the sacrifice of Christ's life, where he is giving up himself for other people, and how that's like the ultimate sacrifice. But on a smaller scale, people should be able to make sacrifices to the group so that the group can like thrive and do really well. And I think that's one of the main points of righteousness, which would be selflessness. You need to take care of yourself, but at the same time, you need to also acknowledge that you're not the center of the universe, and other
Right.
people's feelings matter too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you bet. So I don't know why it occurred to me so late in life, but it was just not long ago. My wife and we weren't arguing. We don't really argue so much, but we were kind of having a tense conversation. And I was kind of behaving badly. I was sort of aggravated, kind of pouting around and, whatever. And I don't remember exactly how it went down, but she basically just came over and just kind of put her hand on the back of my neck and just told me she loved me. And it was more than an olive branch. It was more than a peace offering. It was, you know, I'm with you. I get it. And you're behaving badly right now, but you know what? I'm not going anywhere. And what it is was it just diffused the whole situation. And when people step up and they say, you know what, I did that wrong, or I shouldn't have done that, or that was my mistake, that's on me, then I think that the whole tone of relationship changes in that moment, don't you?
Yeah, a lot of
Yeah,
people are very image conscious because if you admit that you did something wrong, a lot of people are scared, and I think rightfully scared, that that's going to shift your image in the negative to other people. But it
yeah,
often does the opposite, where it demonstrates to the group that you are able to adjust and to learn from what you've done, which is a huge
yeah,
plus over the long
bet.
term. In the short term, yeah, everybody makes mistakes. But if you're the kind of person who always tries to sweep stuff under the rug, people are going to figure that out. And they're going to see you
Right.
as someone who's just posturing all the time instead of actually living a fulfilling and good life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's work just maintaining the charade of being always right, and being perfect and the go-to person. That's a lot of work. I don't think I want to do that so much anymore. As a pastor, I'm pretty transparent with my congregation. When I screw up, I try to tell them,
Mm-hmm.
and really I draw on my own foibles and my shortcomings, my pitfalls, just to teach. And I find freedom in that. Not that I'm just going to wallow in my brokenness or my mistakes, but it's okay to make a mistake. Just don't keep making it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah.
So the other big item that I wanted to tackle with you, that Mahler X, aka Salem, was saying was an area of expertise for you, was some Bible history. Uh, the Bible is a very large book, but it wasn't all written at the same time by the same person. It was a compilation of different books. You mentioned the letter written by Jude. Paul wrote Romans. You've got different authors over time. So, just for the big picture for people, what's your knowledge of the different books of the Bible, who they were written by, and kind of the general time frame that the Bible was written in from Genesis to Revelation?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So the Protestant Bible has 66 books. So to talk about the Bible as a book is a little bit of a misspeak, only because it's more like a collection of books. But as a book, and we can use that term, there are two divisions: the New Testament and the Old Testament. So the Old Testament would cover the time period and events prior to Jesus, and the New Testament would include the time period of Jesus forward into the birth of the church. So in the Old Testament, you've got a period of history, and these are going to be very approximate dates, but a period of history that would span roughly about 2000 BC to 500 BC. Now, that's not including sort of the description of Adam and Eve in the garden and the opening moments of creation in Genesis 1. Those things would probably go back even further, and it would be hard to pin those down chronologically. But really, 98% of the Old Testament would land somewhere between 2000 and 500 BC. So,
And quick question, what language would that have been written in?
yeah, almost entirely Hebrew.
Hmm.
Now later on, Hebrew sort of morphed, and there were other languages similar to that. There's a little bit of the Old Testament written in the ancient language of Aramaic, which actually would have been the language of Jesus's day, probably the language that Jesus spoke. You might think of Aramaic and Hebrew relating to one another like modern English and let's say like Shakespearean English.
Hmm.
Very, very similar, right? So we don't know exactly who all the authors of those Old Testament books were, but that's going to be the history. Now, the New Testament starts at really zero, right? We think Jesus was probably born. Um, Best guess would be somewhere around 4 BC, and then died at about AD 29. So that would represent his 33 years of life on this earth. The New Testament covers only a span of really less than 100 years. So it would be the first century AD. Pretty much all those, most of the New Testament books we know authors of either through just evidence in the text where the author is identified, or through the tradition of the church, through just our writings on the books. There are a few we're not sure, like the letter to the Hebrews. We don't really know who wrote that. Um, but that sort of situates things in context. Now, here's something interesting. I mentioned that the Protestant Bible has 66 books. The Roman Catholic Bible has more. I think there are about a dozen more books. Some of the Catholic folks in the audience might be able to be more precise with this. But these extra books were largely written in Greek, and I should say too, the New Testament was written entirely in Greek, which was the universal language of the day. Um, the extra Catholic books were written in Greek, and they came out of that period roughly between the end of the Old Testament era, which would be roughly 500 BC, and the time of the birth of Christ at zero, right, or 4 BC. So in that 500-year window, we get these other books that are part of the Roman Catholic Bible.
15 books of the Apocrypha is what Chad is saying.
Is it 15? Okay, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. And so the word Apocrypha is actually a Protestant term for those books. A Roman Catholic would call those the deuterocanonical books, kind of the second canon. And canon just means like the authoritative set of books, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then that kind of leads into another question of how and when was it decided what books made the Bible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Old Testament is pretty much understood as what we would call a closed canon, right? Finalized by the time of Christ. Interestingly, in the 1940s, um, a shepherd in the region of Palestine discovered among some caves some clay jars containing some ancient documents. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we have complete collections of the Old Testament documents um, in the 1940s, and these documents date back to the time of Jesus and even earlier. So the Old Testament canon has been closed for a long time. It's been set. That was the Bible that Jesus would have read.
Mm-hmm.
The New Testament canon came, it was a process that was really probably finalized in the fourth century through church councils, because there were other documents that were being introduced and suggested and offered for worship that the mainline church just said these are not authentic, these aren't theologically accurate. We're not going to have them as part of our canon. So that's when the list was determined. But they're actually there's something called a Muratorian fragment, which is a piece that's recorded in a history book from the fourth century that lists the books of the New Testament as we have them now.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And then that, I guess, to tie it off, how and why is it decided that Revelation is the last book and no other books are being added? Because you have, say, LDS who consider themselves Christian and they added the Book of Mormon at the end and
Right.
consider that all part of the same thing. But now it's more so that you have spiritual figures and leaders in Christianity and they can do a lot of writing, say Wesley, and they make a big impact, but it doesn't get added into the Bible.
Right. Yeah. So, there are lots of writings that are useful, and in fact, I would add to that many of the books in what Protestants call the Apocrypha, right? Those 15 books of the Catholic Bible. There's some really useful stuff. In fact, I taught a course last week, and I made use of some of that in class because there's some rich history that's critical for understanding what's happening um, in the context of the first century. Now, there's a passage, and I'm actually just pulling it up here in my Bible because anytime we talk about scripture, I always like to go to it so we get it right. But there's a passage there very near the end of the book of Revelation. It's the last couple of verses. And I think this is what you're getting at. Is it says, the author says, I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. So I think it's important to remember that the Revelation is this piece. This book is the book that the author's talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
The author is not talking about the whole Bible. But if we don't understand that the Bible is a collection of books, then we'll misread that.
Right. And Revelation, for people who don't know, is, from my perspective, it talks a lot about the end times, which does make it fit pretty nicely as a final book
Yeah.
of the Bible, where
Yeah.
it's talking about when Christ will return, what will happen with the Antichrist, and just the different periods. I think there's another period of like 1,000 or so or some odd years where Christ is on earth and people are living in peace with him before they all go to heaven and stuff.
Yeah, so there is this 1,000-year period, and I'll tell you, Revelation is very difficult because it represents a genre that we don't relate to, we don't understand. It's apocalyptic literature, and the word apocalypse literally means an uncovering. Like if you pull a blanket off of someone, you've just the Greek word is what is it? Apokaleo, you uncover them, right? You remove the veil. So that we call the book of Revelation. Revelation is following that genre of apocalypse, meaning we're revealing something's being revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's this picture of how everything's going to end. And Revelation chapters 21 and 22 are the last two chapters of the book. And what they do is they anticipate and they describe um, eternity. And what's interesting, Neuro, is that it's not harps and halos. It's not little cherubs, little babies flying around as disembodied people, strumming their harps and with wings and all this, floating on the clouds. That's not at all the biblical view of eternity. The biblical view of eternity is the earth made new, the earth restored. It's physical, right? I mean, it's a city, there are stones, there are lights, there are, all kinds of stuff that would correspond well with our world, minus all the bad stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting is you have really in the entire Bible, the way it's organized as a canon, you have Genesis 1, which ends on the seventh day with God looking at all that he had created, blessing the seventh day, declaring all that he had created very good, and then ceasing from his work, which is to say, able to enjoy his creation.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple chapters later, we get this big detour where Adam and Eve just sort of go off and do their own thing and totally violate God's law by rationalizing their own will. And then the bottom falls out. And basically, the rest of the Bible is like a Google Maps detour, rerouting us back to where we needed to be in the first place. which then ends at this closing bookend of the new creation, back where God wanted us to be in the first place. So it really is an amazing structure to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that the Bible doesn't exactly have a Disney ending?
Well, yeah, I don't know that it's a Disney ending, but it's a good one, and it's a compelling vision
It's a triumphant
that
one.
it is absolutely triumphant. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the word in Greek for victory is, or to be victorious is nikao. So I'm pretty sure the word Nike comes from that Greek word,
Mm-hmm.
to win.
Cool. So I have a map here that I pulled up of it's Israel at the time of Jesus, and Israel obviously was not a country as it is now in that period of time, but you've got Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Decapolis, and Perea all in this sort of region. And to get a sense of the time period and the era, so people are understanding the context of Christ's life, this was an area controlled by the Romans, because there's a quote, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's," from Christ. So Rome would have had control over this region at this time. There's Egypt that's down to the south and the west of Judea, but I don't think they had direct control at that period. This whole region is kind of between the Egyptian Empire, which was very powerful for a long period of time, and then the Roman Empire, which extended down before and through Christ's life.
Yeah, so, Israel as a nation, and more specifically that landmass that we know as Canaan or Palestine, is very strategic in a military sense because it's like a land bridge between three continental land masses. If you control Israel, then you have control over the crossroads to Asia, Europe, and Africa. And so we were talking a little bit about that 500-year period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. Well, there's a lot of significant stuff that happened during that time that gave shape to the context for the New Testament. And if we don't know that history, and largely the church doesn't know that history, then we're not going to really get a lot of what's happening in the New Testament. So, for instance, roughly around 400 BC, we get the rise of Greek culture and the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire grew under Alexander the Great. He left his empire to four different regions. Two of those were Egypt that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and Syria. Egypt to the southwest of Israel and Syria to the north. Those two nations, those two kingdoms, dominated Israel back and forth for a couple of hundred years until finally Rome rose as the empire of the day. And then somewhere around 60 BC, Caesar sent the general Pompey to Palestine to settle rebellions. And that established, as you indicated, Roman occupancy of Israel from that point forward through the New Testament era. And it was brutal. So we've got Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor appointed, who was in place at the arrest and the conviction of Jesus. So that's kind of what explains the landscape. And when Rome came in, there was already a lot of Greek culture and influence established. Rome just sort of tweaked that a bit with some of their own spin, but it was mainly a culture and a social and political reality that was opposed to Israel's distinctives as a holy people of God. So just constant tension between the Israelites and the Greco-Romans.
That ties into another question about the people of Israel and the Pharisees, the Jews, and Christ's message, and how his message was radical and different in a lot of ways that upset a lot of the establishment there. So even though maybe Rome has military and government control of the region, there still would have been the spiritual hierarchy and what have you of the Pharisees. So what was that structure like, basically? Because they're writing in Hebrew, maybe speaking Aramaic, and they're studying the Old Testament, which they would have called the Bible.
Right.
And Christ is coming up with new ideas that are different from that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So when Jesus came to life, when he was born, and he entered the world, this Greco-Roman influence, this culture, government, the way cities were organized, the kind of art you see, the what you watch in the theater, um, and certainly the language. All of this world was Greco-Roman at that point. That cultural influence was so strong. And what happened was that the Jews responded to that in different ways. And this is what's interesting, I think, from a historical perspective. So you get groups like the Sadducees, which is one of the religious movements or sects within Judaism. The Sadducees were very progressive, lots of new ideas, very liberal in their thinking. They embraced the Greco-Roman culture, and they said, "This is a great deal. You guys are crazy if you don't go along with it." But on the other hand, you've got people who are very fiercely devoted to the traditional tenets of the faith. And so they resisted the culture. These people are called zealots, Zealots. They have zeal for the law. And so they opposed the Greco-Roman culture, even to the point of fighting. I mean, they would go to war over it, and they did. Some of them did. So those are kind of two opposite perspectives. There was a third that ties into the idea of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a group who said, we don't want to fight against it, and we don't want to adopt this culture. We're just going to leave. And so these folks became separatists, sort of like Amish are today. Mm-hmm. They just sort of removed themselves from society, and a big group established themselves on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea in the area known as Qumran. And this is where those Dead Sea Scrolls were found. These were documents from their library. So that's a third response. And then comes the fourth one. And this interestingly is what really represents the Pharisees. The Pharisees said, we don't want to leave, we don't want to fight, we don't want to accommodate to the culture. So what are we going to do? So they chose to try to live in the culture without being a part of it. And it was kind of a tough road to hoe, because they could sort of fall off on either side at any given point. But they were very committed to preserving God's word. They were very committed to personal and community holiness. They were committed to educating people in the outlying regions, not just those in the city. They had a really balanced view between the role of human will and what we would call God's sovereignty or God's control. So they recognized that there was kind of a balance between these things. And there were other things about the Pharisees that I think actually are quite attractive. But what happened was, over time, they got more interested in the form of their religion, their practices, their outer exterior things, at the expense of the inner disposition of the heart. So when Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, he's speaking really against the abuses of Phariseeism. So Jesus came in not to preach anything new, but to really course correct. What I like to say is, he didn't come to turn the world upside down. He came to turn the religious world right side up, and to show us what pure, undefiled religion would look like.
Right.
I sometimes think I answer in too many words, Neuro. I'm sorry.
I think I can
talk.
I'm trying to break that down, but I think basically he's not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. He's looking at the same Bible that the Pharisees are looking at. And you said course corrected. He's giving a different interpretation than they are. And he's also speaking as the Messiah, which is an interesting dynamic for them. And that's an aspect that for the time would have been an area of doubt and questioning for a lot of people. You have the story of that with a lot of the disciples of Christ and how they're wrestling with this, like Saul becoming Paul and living a certain life, and then having Christ revealed to him, and then changing into a person who's effectively reborn in a way. That would have been a really difficult thing to reconcile with, because as we know, there's no shortage of people who will say that they are Jesus. At the time, I'm sure there are many people who would have spoke up and said that they were the coming of the Messiah or whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, and history records that. And even from non-Christian perspectives, a great source for this is a collection of writings by a first century Jew named Josephus. This stuff is fascinating, really rich, super helpful. But the word that, we talked about in Revelation, the Antichrist, really points to people who claim to be Messiah but aren't. That's the sense of the word Antichrist.
mm-hmm.
It's not some figure, with horns on his head. It's somebody who says, I'm Jesus, follow me.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not. Yeah.
Cool. So one thing that ties into some of the questions that we ended up getting was the impact of Christianity and how it has influenced the culture of the world. So Christianity, I believe, is still the number one practiced faith globally. And it's had a lot of influence on the kind of laws that countries have and that sort of thing. And we talked some about the issues of organized religion gaining a whole bunch of power. In the case of the Pharisees here, it seems like they would have had some power, which could have caused them to maybe be a little bit wrapped up in that and corrupted a little bit, but it wouldn't have been of the scale of the Roman Catholic Church and sending crusades and all that kind of thing.
Right.
But
yeah, absolutely.
In the United States, Christianity still has a major impact on the political sphere and how laws are written. I would say most people who are representatives, senators, that kind of thing, typically identify as Christian. Whether they're actually Christian in their heart is a different question, but it's definitely still a dominating force in the U.S. But it seems to be waning somewhat. There are less people attending church. COVID obviously was not very kind to people meeting and gathering in certain places. So how would you say the state of Christianity is currently in the U.S. and globally?
Yeah, so in the U.S., I would say it's more than waning. I would say it's in decline. It's in steep decline. I don't have numbers, but I think I would probably be less optimistic about the number of our leaders who are Christian or who would even be sympathetic to a Christian view. What I see more and more, especially in social media and the news, is just what seems to be an underlying hostility toward Christian views. Lots of things lead me to that conclusion. More and more, we're distancing ourselves from our Christian roots, while at the same time, in what we call the majority world, we used to use the word the third world, which isn't a helpful term at all, but the majority world, the world where most people live these days, Christianity is really on the advance. So I work with an organization called The Word Is Out, which really is devoted to the cause of understanding the Bible, having some biblical literacy. And what we're seeing in Africa in particular, on the African continent, is that Christianity is growing like crazy. But the pastors who are planning these churches and leading these churches really don't know the Bible largely. And so what they're doing is they're building their ministries on a few verses. And a lot of what they see and hear is piped in through Western television, and it's prosperity gospel. So it's a really unhealthy church. And in some cases, people are getting hurt because of the poor practice of the faith. It's not that they're doing things to be evil. They just don't know. They don't know anymore. They don't know any different. So we're working hard to try to help correct that.
There's a big problem that I noticed growing up with the way that people deliver Christianity to other people, in trying to have something that's really loud and convincing and charismatic, and how charisma is, I would say, a morally neutral aspect of a person, where you can be a smooth talker. It doesn't mean you're a good person. You could be a very bad person and have very high charisma. So for this, people are learning Christianity from TV. I don't really like that. Whenever I was Christian growing up, and we were told at certain points that you should go door to door and tell people about Christ. I didn't really like that format. For me, the preferred method was I want to be the best person that I can, so that when a conversation about it comes up, people would ask me, where do you find your morality? Where do you find how you get spiritually fulfilled? And then you have a conversation that's off the back of, say, a long friendship. And that ends up being a lot deeper of a conversation and an interaction, because it's given a lot of substance by your actions over time, not just you can do a really good sales pitch for whatever your belief system is.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there, Neuro. There's a lot of stuff out in the world today that passes off as Christian that's really not very Christian. A lot of stuff that is very helpful for coming from the Christian church and in the Christian world. One of the things that we've seen over the last few decades is this emergence of what's called relational evangelism, where people actually take the time to get to know others. They learn their stories, their hurts, their histories, their hopes. It's through this relationship that's grounded in mutual trust that people can share their faith, and I think that's a lot more reasonable. That suits who I am in terms of my personality. I'm not a confrontational person, so the door-to-door thing doesn't really work for me. But for some people, it's great, and people have come to, a saving faith of Christ through somebody knocking on their door. I have a family member that I love very much who became Mormon because somebody came and knocked on her door, and she's a faithful woman, very godly. So it's not that I'm opposed to that method. I just don't want that to be my only choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've got about 20 minutes left in the hour and a half that we talked about, and we do have some questions. Are you keen to tackle some of those?
Yeah, I'll do my best. Honestly, I'm not an expert. The field that I'm in requires some working knowledge in lots of disciplines. So as a result, I really haven't mastered any of those. But yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to entertain a question.
Well, as we talked about in the meeting before this, I try to encourage my community to be respectful. So feel free to not answer any of these, but these were passed along by Mahler X. The first one was from a viewer. I read an article a few years ago that argued that the conflict between the Apostle Paul and the other apostles of Jesus was much more acrimonious than the biblical account describes. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'd like to see the article because that would require us to appeal to information outside of the Bible to warrant that claim. There are some seeming tensions between Paul and the other apostles, but I don't think they're significant just based on the reading of the New Testament. So I don't know what evidence in history that we can appeal to in terms of ancient writings that would point to more detail or a richer description of those tensions.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a great answer for that.
If I would guess at it, it's after Christ passes, I'm kind of theory crafting here. It would be hard to get the complete answer on what would Jesus do or what would Jesus say. And they can all have their own opinions on that based on their experience with him, but maybe they had some different experiences and they have their own life experience that they're drawing from as well. So yeah, you're not going to have 12 people all on the same page for everything.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a point in which, and this is out of the biblical account, where the Apostle Peter was following his call to take the good news of Jesus to the Gentiles, which is in effect to take it outside the parish of Judaism into the non-Jewish world. But there were some Jews who became Christians that felt like the Gentiles had to become Jewish first. So this is really at the heart of like Paul's letter to the Romans. What is the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? There was this dialogue between Paul and Peter about what's the best way to handle this. And like I said, at worst, it's a tension between those two, but really not conflict and certainly not any contradictory kinds of work. Other people will say Paul talks about the role of works in the life of the believer, the role of their practices. in one way, and James in his letter talks about works, and he seems to be drawing the opposite conclusion. But what you have to do is you have to understand how each author is using the word works and what they mean by that within the context. And if you do that, if you read faithfully within each of those books, I think you find that there's really not a conflict, that they're talking about two different sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Cool. The next one is from a Jewish Israeli saying, I found myself wondering, what is the position of your church on Jews, specifically in modern times, and how do you view the future of the Jewish people as seen from the point of view of Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a clear answer. The United Methodist Church probably has a statement on that, and I would need to look it up. And I'm happy to do some of this work after the conversation today. But I'd go back to the letter of the Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says that the Jews will eventually be grafted back into um, status as the people of God.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my perspective, and I think this is true of a lot of Methodists, we value our Jewish brothers and sisters. In fact, I've got a great relationship with a gentleman who leads a Messianic Jewish congregation nearby. And in fact, I bring him in, and he always talks to my classes when I teach, because I think as traditional Christians, we've lost so much of our Jewish heritage because Jesus was a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
He came out of Judaism, and his idea wasn't to bankrupt Judaism. His idea was to fulfill it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we as Christians today have a fairly impoverished version of our faith because we've lost our Jewish heritage. So that's not a great answer, but that's about the best I can do at the moment.
Cool. There's a question on, I'd be interested to know how Pastor Brad handles the inconsistencies and contradictions in the Bible from an existential perspective and for his own relationship with his faith.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that question. So I would need to press back and just ask what the individual means by existential perspective, because that word existential gets used a lot with different meanings. So I would need to sort of clarify that, and then I would also need to clarify, what do you mean by a contradiction or an inconsistency? Because I don't see any contradictions in the Bible. I see some things that stand in tension. I see other things that maybe even rise to the level of conflict. Some things are in conflict with one another. But a contradiction is literally two statements that cannot be both true at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like God is good and God is not good. That's a contradiction. I don't know of any occurrence in the Bible where I see anything approximating that. Um,
The only
sometimes what see, oh, go ahead.
you said God is good, God is not good. One thing that I noticed reading the Old Testament to the New Testament is I would say the stance or the personality of God seems to be more loving and graceful in the New Testament, and in the Old Testament, it's more like direct in, I guess, the expression of wrath would be an example. So having someone be turned into a pillar of salt as opposed to the way that Christ conducted himself, it
Yeah.
seems like a much kinder uh, expression.
Yeah. And so here's where I think not having an, uh, an understanding of the Bible sort of creates these false illusions. Because as I read through the entire Bible over and over again, I see a much greater consistency. For example, when God disciplines people in the Old Testament, it's always because he wants to bring them back to him. The purpose is to restore them to their right standing relationship with him. And then in the New Testament, we sort of gloss over parts like in the book of Acts, where this couple was supposed to sell off their land and give the money to the church. That's what everybody was doing. Well, they lied about how much they had, and they deceived the disciples, and the Holy Spirit struck them both dead right there. So we see a much more balanced view of God if we read the whole of the Bible rather than just kind of cherry picking things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there was
Yeah.
a quote that's referenced a lot to me that his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, which to me I read as it's not necessarily meant to be that a person can completely understand the Word of God. So the Bible isn't like it's not exactly an easy to figure out set of books.
Yeah. Yeah. And so one thing that would distinguish my faith practice from Mormonism is that I don't keep any secrets, right? There are certain things in Mormonism, as I understand it, that are secret. That means that other people aren't privileged to those. My understanding of faith is that everything is out in the open. There are no secrets. But some things that are out in the open are just difficult to understand, and that's what we call the mystery of God. It's in plain sight, but it's sometimes so big and so complex that we're not going to fully get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the next one is, be interested to hear about the intersection of faith and politics from Pastor Brad, specifically his thoughts on what's referred to as evangelicals as a voting bloc and how it differs from his faith, if it differs at all. I guess this relates to engagement of Christians in politics.
Yeah, it does. And that's a very reasonable question. It's a good one. I'm just looking at the time, Neuro, and I don't know that I can address that in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
So I regrettably and respectfully will just take a pass on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just going to be a tough one for me.
Here's one that relates to Revelation. The Last Languages campaign seeks to have the Bible translated into all languages of the world by 2025. I believe the Bible states that this is a condition of the apocalypse. Do you think that this is going to kickstart the end times?
Yeah. Well, the Bible says, well, Jesus, in fact, says clearly that no one knows the day or the hour, not even Jesus himself. So I'm not going to predict anything. Having the Bible translated into every known language would be one thing. Having that message then made available to those people would be another, right? So, yeah. I think it's an admirable goal. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have some family members who they are looking for a lot of clues and signs of the end times, and it can be a little bit of a dangerous game, and I think it ends up making people look foolish a lot of times when they'll set particular dates of, I think that this is going to happen at this time and that's going to happen at that time, when, like you said, no one's going to know the hour or the date. I think there is an analogy. It would be when he returns like a thief in the night. I remember a Christian gospel song that was about that.
The Thief in the Night?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I remember that, a band from like late the 70s or early 80s. Yeah, if I remember. I think I remember something like that. And because we don't know and we're not going to know, I just choose to live my life as Jesus said, just always being prepared, living my life as though it could happen right now. So that there are no regrets, no apologies needed. Just, I'm living as I should.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are getting pretty close on time, and I don't want to hold you up too much. Another interesting one. What are your thoughts on the need for a post-deity morality as opposed by Friedrich Nietzsche?
Now, there's a question I am just not prepared to answer because I'm not familiar enough with Nietzsche's work. Not studied him. Yeah. I would need to defer to somebody else on that one. Great question, though.
All right. We have some follow-ups and clarifications for you that are in the Discord. This will be on YouTube, so if people have more questions, they could potentially be handed along. This was really fun. I feel like a lot of these questions and concepts that we had, we could talk about any one thing for another half hour for each of them, but we've tried to keep it rolling. Let's see another one. If I remember correctly, God is described as omnibenevolent and omnipotent, so isn't it paradoxical if he's all good and all powerful? I would imagine he wouldn't be willing to let any evil things happen. I think this is called Theodicy as a concept.
It is, yeah, yeah, very excellent. Yeah. So theodicy is sort of an explanation for why evil exists if there is a God
Hmm.
and he is good. So this requires really understanding, or I should say, defining what we mean by evil. So if I step on a nail and it hurts, and is the pain kind of a form of evil? Is it an indication that something's wrong in the world? Or if a drunk driver crosses the center line and hits me and I die, is that an evil? Why would God allow that?
Hmm.
I think a lot of what we point to as evil really may not be evil in the grand design of things, but that's not to say that there's not evil in the world, because there is.
Hmm.
Now, how can God be good and allow evil in the world? Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not God and I can't speak to the question fully, but I can say as a parent that, part of my role as a dad is to release my kids to be free. And in that releasing, they're outside my protection. I can't take care of them anymore. So my choice is to keep them home under my wing or to expose them to the world where they're free to make choices. And some of those choices will be evil. But as a person rooted in a Wesleyan tradition, and really more importantly, I think someone grounded in what I perceive to be, a reasonable understanding of Scripture, we are free,
Hmm.
and with the freedom comes the opportunity to commit evil.
Freedom to make your
Now
own
that
mistakes, kind of a thing.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. That doesn't cover things like, if God is good, why does a baby get cancer and die,
Hmm.
right? Well, again, that's just part of the mystery of God. I don't know, but I found that He's been faithful in so much other so many other areas of life, that I'm inclined just to trust Him, even though I don't understand it, and even if I don't like it.
Hmm. Quick, fun question from me. What is your favorite translation of the Bible?
Oh, that's a great question, Neuro. Honestly, it depends on what I'm doing. Um, if I'm doing scholarly research, I'm going to use the original languages, the Greek and the Hebrew. If I'm preaching a sermon, I'll use a standard version, like the English Standard Version or the Revised Standard Version, because these are pretty literal,
Hmm.
and based on state of the art manuscript evidence. Just want to get a sense of what the message is. I might pick up a paraphrase, just something that's not a word for word translation. A great one is by a guy named Eugene Peterson, whose whose work, The Message, is a translation of the Bible into just sort of common everyday language.
Hmm. You can read
So it kind
Greek
of
and
depends on what
Hebrew
I'm
and
doing.
stuff?
Well, not fluently. My Hebrew is very rusty. The Greek, I can do some, but I do need some help with it, especially since I've been away from it for the last 5 or 6 years. I've not been actively teaching it, so that's kind of slowed me down a bit. But it honestly, it's very accessible. Learning Greek is easier than learning a modern spoken language, because it's a very systematic and very predictable language, and you don't have to speak it. You just have to read it. You just got to recognize it. So
Hmm.
that's far more within reach than you would think.
Yeah, I remember our pastor in Texas talked about agape love. Love is a English word, but there are many different kinds of love. You can have your romantic love for your partner. You can have a love for a friend. You can have a love for a hobby or something that you really enjoy. And I think Greek has more words for those different kinds of love. And agape love was described to us as the kind of love that Christ brought, where you're so like loving the other person that you would be willing to lay down your life for them. So it's kind of like
Yeah,
the ultimate expression of love. And
yeah,
that aspect of drawing on what were the Greek words that were used, what were the Hebrew words, can add a lot of context. Every language is different in some capacity, so some concepts can be lost in translation, and you also want to have the
right.
context of what was the state of the world when the person was writing this, and what was the culture and all that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, it adds a whole new dimension. It's like, oh, it's like going into the original languages is like putting an antenna up for your indoor TV if you're watching over the air channels. You might be able to get some channels inside and enough to really enjoy a program, but when you put that antenna up, your clarity increases exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think original language study is so helpful. Yeah. And I'm seeing something here in the chat that Mahler X has passed on. I'm going to offer an apology. Somebody who's speaking as a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints disagreed with my comment about things being secret. So I will apologize if I misrepresented that. So I wanted to be clear about that.
Another comment, no questions, just want to thank you both. And then someone said, thank you for tenderly addressing the subject. As a Christian, I know that often believers come across very forcefully and insensitively. Appreciate discussion without forcing anything on non-believers and believers being challenged. It's all about healthy Socratic dialogue when trying to understand different worldviews. And really that was the intention of this conversation in the first place was, I'm not really here to debate you. We're not trying to argue with each other about stuff. It's just laying out the perspective and trying to figure out what the impact of Christianity and the Bible is on the world. And you nailed that. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah.
And thank you, Mahler X, for linking us up and handling questions. Yeah.
So Mahler X and I hope we're going to connect this Saturday evening over some good food and time with some good friends. So I'm looking forward to that. Neuro, I thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate you. I appreciate your perspective. I think it's healthy, and I think in some ways it's healing. So yeah, thanks for who you are and what you're doing.
Awesome. Well, this will be on YouTube. So if there are any other comments and things, you could check them on there. There are obviously a lot more questions and messages here in the Discord, which you could think about. But this was awesome. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about all this. Stay safe. Take care of yourself.
Yep, you too. All of y'all.
Thank you, Pastor Brad, for talking with us about Christianity and the Bible. Nice. That was awesome. Imagine talking about religion on Twitch and people not freaking out. Good job, chat. There were no fights. There were some questions. Not everyone believes in the same thing, so it's really important to be able to discuss it in an even-handed way where you can just try to listen. There was a quote from Daniel Dennett that really stuck with me that's been a cornerstone of how I try to approach conversations with people who have a different belief system than me. And he said, when you're having a debate or an argument or a discussion with someone, you should be able to understand their perspective so well that if you were to explain it to them, they would say, oh yeah, I wish I would have thought of it that way. Like, you should have a very complete and true understanding before you get into some kind of argument and debate. A really unfortunate thing that some people will do is they'll just spew out some talking points that their side of the argument has said. So maybe you're an atheist and you heard Sam Harris say some quip or some phrase that was really snazzy and catchy. You can echo that at a Christian person as kind of ammo for a debate that makes it feel like you can win an argument against them. But that didn't really come from you. You're passing along something that you agreed with to the other person, but you're not really listening to that person, figuring out where they are as an individual and trying to engage them and understand them and then build a productive conversation with them. Helps you can approach the topic as an agnostic without shitting on the people who believe. Really sets the tone of respect for all. Well, the way that I see it is I kind of think of Christianity as a team of people who have to share this earth with us. So if we can be, I don't know if ally is the right word, but if we can all be people, all be humans who are working together to be better, you can work to be a better human being next to someone who you don't agree with everything on. Like, that's a huge part of, I think, the problem that we have in the world is a lot of our beliefs get us polarized. Yeah, we can be united. Yeah. They polarize us to where the opposite sides, and this is a thing that I said in the interview with Aorit, the opposite sides are so pitted against each other that they see the other side as inherently dumb. If you're doing this, if you have that reaction, I would really recommend you to challenge that, because it prevents you from respecting their ability to think critically and to find some common ground. Common ground and striving for that is, I think, what we need. It doesn't mean that you need to agree with everything that someone says. It doesn't mean that you can't take issue with certain aspects of what they believe. You should. Like, you should be true and honest about your perspective, but at the same time, we can't move forward if we can't agree on anything. Am I a pastor? I'm not. I'm a Zerg streamer.